So I just have the wonderful job of finding examples all around the world and watching great projects unfold. So just to pick a few examples that I've seen recently that I think exemplify what this is all about. In the past school year, I heard about and actually met with some students from Rhode Island, elementary students, and their teacher. They had been in a very typical kind of memorization style lesson. They were learning about their state symbols and kind of running down the list of state symbols, identifying them. And it was going to be just one piece of a lesson about, getting to know your state, your typical geography lesson. Not much inquiry at all there, just kind of memorization and recall. One of the kids asked an interesting question, which was, why do we not have a state insect? And the teacher could have just had a quick answer or perhaps a little conversation and moved on. But instead, she paused and said, I don't know. Maybe we should find out. Do other states have state insects? So that was the start of what became a really fascinating interdisciplinary real world project where these fourth graders discovered that their state was one of the very few in the country that did not have a state insect. So then that caused them to think, well, should we have one? And if so, what should it be? What's really unique about the place where we live? What could we pick that needs our advocacy? And so they became incredible advocates for an insect called the American burying beetle that serves a very important role in the ecosystem as a natural recycler of, decomposed materials. And it happens to be endangered, and it happens to live in a part of Rhode Island that's very close to where these kids live. So throughout the year, instead of just having a short-term geography quiz about our state symbols, now they were learning about environmental science, why do some animals become endangered? What can we do as humans to protect them? They learned about the political process. If we want to propose a law to protect and designate this as our insect, what would happen? By the end of the year, they were on the floor of the State House and actually got a bill passed. And so Rhode Island now has a state insect, thanks to the efforts of these fourth graders. I think that's one really great example of a lesson, a kind of a simple lesson that got remodeled into a very wonderful, rich inquiry project. And that's often where good project ideas start. You start with something you've always taught and then realize, there's another way, a better way to go deeper into this content. So that's an elementary example. I've seen, lots and lots of examples that result in students producing something. And I think one of the great things to think about project-based learning is what they produce doesn't have to be predictable. It may well be a physical object. We often see students coming up with designs. I just recently wrote for Edutopia about some students who designed back-to-school products for their peers. So they worked with actually a major retailer to come up with a line of products that better meet the needs of students who knows better than one student to another, what's wrong with our backpacks? What doesn't work well with our materials that we use for teaching and, for learning every day, the stuff we carry with us. And they had these great insights like, we get assigned homework, but homework doesn't necessarily happen at home. We might do it on a bus. We might do it on the way to a sporting event. We might do it in a coffee house with wireless. So let's design some different products to do homework. And they worked hand in hand with some professional designers and came up with a line of back to school products. So that was one really interesting take. They were middle school kids. Very interesting in-depth project where they got to have that back and forth with experts, which we often see in project-based learning. And in this case, they actually got to see their products go all the way through the manufacturing and marketing process. So that was pretty great. But it doesn't have to be a physical object that represents what students know and can do. I think the example I just talked about with the insect designation, students had products there, but their products were things like letters to the editor, speeches before the floor of the State House, things like that. So a product might be an advocacy campaign. In Portland, Oregon, where I happen to live, some students in the last year or two ran a very successful advocacy campaign to designate non-smoking areas of public parks because they realized in their investigation, in their research, they didn't want to be around cigarette smoke when they were out enjoying nature. And they thought that this is something the city could address. And indeed, they were able to get some allies, at City Hall to move that forward. So the product could be any number of different things. And the content area can also dip into many different, sometimes interdisciplinary, sometimes, single subject. So there's quite a wide range. Those are just a few examples. I could go on and on. Great. Okay, sure. So I'm kind of excited to see project-based learning taking hold in a lot of different contexts. I think in the early days, the past decade or so, some of the advanced scouts, I like to think of them, have been in schools that do project-based learning wall to wall. So these are networks like High Tech High, New Tech Network, which have been very successful and I think have kind of laid some of the groundwork of what makes for very effective, high quality project-based learning. But there are lots of other places where project-based learning is taking hold. In my own work, I've worked with alternative schools. I've worked with international schools around the world. I've worked with teachers who are doing 1 or 2 projects a year instead of this being at the heart of their curriculum. But I think the schools where it's really taking hold, or the school systems where it's taking hold, have a few things in common. And this is reinforced by some of the research my colleagues at the Buck Institute for Education have done, which is I'm affiliated with BIE as part of their national faculty. And in their research, they find that projects project-based learning takes hold when teachers have time to collaborate with each other, time to dig in and experience a different kind of curriculum design, different strategies for teaching and learning than they even got to experience as learners themselves. They need a little time for that to settle in, for them to get comfortable with that, to kind of get their sea legs with that. But when that's in place, when teachers have that time for collaborative professional development, for inquiry of their own about what makes for good PBL, they get to kind of start to feel it almost at a gut level of now I know what it's like to be a learner in this context. That's when we see project-based learning taking hold. And we also see in those contexts teacher satisfaction increasing. So not only do we get great outcomes for kids, we know that kids are mastering the core content through PBL. They're doing as well or better on the standardized tests. Engagement increases. All those good things are happening, and teachers are liking their work better. So I think those are all wins. I could give some examples of individual schools, but I think the most exciting things are just knowing that this is a strategy for teaching and learning that can take hold in almost any context. I've written extensively about different schools where it's happening, but I think what you see is a need for teacher interest, teacher-driven interest, teachers realizing that this is a better way for their kids and actually a more enjoyable experience for them as teachers. So lots of examples out there, and I'm going to continue writing about them and sharing those stories because I think we need to see that this can work in almost any setting. I've seen it work in small rural schools. I've seen it work in big urban schools around the world, different kinds of contexts. So context doesn't need to be a barrier. Oh gosh, let me think about that. Some of the interesting things we're seeing with project-based learning is how it can be kind of a culture changer. So you might see it starting in a classroom, in a English classroom or social studies classroom, but then you may see kids carrying over this way of approaching problems, approaching their world, and surprising you by coming up with projects for what you might think of as community service or clubs. They've got a way now of talking about framing questions, engaging with experts, coming up with solutions, and it carries them right into life. So I think that's one of the most exciting things that I'm seeing. And so I've seen that happen. I've worked with a couple of different student summits around global problem solving, kids as social entrepreneurs, and they're coming together with this capacity to really frame interesting problems and dig into solutions and come up with original ideas that they just want to do on their own time. Now they've got this skill set that they own. And I think that's the big win here. I think all of the academic outcomes are fantastic. But if kids leave school by the end of their K-12 experience, if they leave with that capacity to be tomorrow's problem solvers, actually today's problem solvers, if they know how to kind of get a committee together, get a team together, a power team, and tackle a solution, whether it's something right on their campus that bothers them, they want a new recycling system that doesn't work, or they want to change the patterns for car traffic around their school because there were bike accidents. All those sorts of projects have emerged, from kids recognizing problems and knowing they can do something about them. Or if they're thinking globally about issues like girls' education around the world and the developing world, and they really feel like they want to step up and do something meaningful for that, those peers on the other side of the world, perhaps from where they live. I'm seeing those examples occurring, and that's what I think makes me most excited.